What happens when a billionaire CEO laughs off a lawsuit, only to realize too late that he's fighting a Supreme Court justice? Richard Langston thought he was untouchable. As the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, he fired people without a second thought. So when a black woman sued him for wrongful termination, he found it amusing. But what he didn't know? She wasn't just any woman. She was one of the most powerful judges in the country. And when the courtroom evidence exposed his darkest secrets, his empire came crashing down. Stay tuned, because this is the downfall of a CEO who thought he was above justice. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so the community can grow, and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. The grand courtroom of the New York Federal District was buzzing with murmurs as reporters, legal analysts, and onlookers filled the benches. It wasn't every day that a billionaire CEO found himself in a lawsuit that had the media foaming at the mouth. At the center of it all sat Richard Langston, a towering figure in the business world. CEO of Langston Tech, a multi-billion-dollar company specializing in artificial intelligence, he was the kind of man who commanded rooms with his presence alone. Sharp gray suit, polished Rolex, and a smirk that barely hid his disdain for the whole ordeal. He looked more like a man attending a business luncheon than one facing serious legal trouble. Seated across from him at the plaintiff's table was a woman whose presence was the complete opposite: calm, composed, and exuding quiet power. Dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue pantsuit, she barely acknowledged the chaos around her. She had no need to. Richard barely spared her a glance as he leaned over to whisper to his lawyer, James Holloway. "Remind me why I'm here again?" James sighed. "Because you're being sued for unlawful termination, racial discrimination, and defamation." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Right, because apparently, firing an incompetent employee is a crime these days." His laughter was just loud enough for the plaintiff's side to hear. The woman at the table did not react. She simply continued reviewing her notes as if she were preparing to handle something far more important than a tech mogul's arrogance. Judge Michael Reynolds entered the courtroom, and the chatter quickly died down. "All rise," the bailiff called out, prompting everyone to stand. As soon as they were seated again, Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses and glanced at the case file before him. "We'll begin with opening statements. Plaintiff, you may proceed." The woman finally stood. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way toward the jury, her every movement poised and deliberate. The room fell silent as she faced them. She smiled. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Justice Evelyn Carter." Richard's smirk faltered ever so slightly. There was something in her tone, an air of authority he hadn't noticed before. Justice? His lawyer, James, straightened in his seat. A flicker of concern flashed across his face, but before he could say anything, Evelyn continued. "For the past 20 years, I have served in various legal capacities, including as a civil rights attorney and a federal judge." She paused, letting that information settle. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she delivered the final blow. "And I currently serve as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court." The room erupted into gasps. Cameras clicked furiously. Even Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Richard's face drained of color. 5 minutes ago, he had laughed at the woman suing him. Now he realized she was one of the most powerful judges in the country. Richard's confidence evaporated in an instant. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. He glanced at his lawyer, who looked equally stunned. Justice Evelyn Carter, a Supreme Court justice. How the hell had he missed that? A murmur of excitement spread through the courtroom. Reporters whispered into their recorders, some frantically typing updates on their tablets. The entire case had just taken a dramatic turn, and everyone knew it. Richard shifted in his seat, his mind racing. This had to be a joke. He had assumed she was just another disgruntled ex-employee trying to squeeze money out of him. He had fired hundreds of people in his career, many of them for good reason. At least, that's what he told himself. But now he had walked straight into a nightmare. Justice Carter continued, her voice steady and authoritative. This case is not just about one man's actions. It is about a pattern of abuse of power, discrimination, and a blatant disregard for the law. She turned, locking eyes with Richard. Mr. Langston believes he is above consequences. Today, we prove otherwise. Richard felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. He could hear the whispers, the quiet gasps. He clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't going to let this woman humiliate him. His lawyer cleared his throat and rose to his feet, attempting to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, while my client respects Justice Carter's impressive credentials, this is still a simple employment dispute. The fact that she holds a judicial position should not influence the court's objectivity. Judge Reynolds studied him for a moment before nodding. Noted. Let's proceed. Richard exhaled slowly. Maybe this wasn't a total disaster. His lawyers were the best money could buy, and they'd find a way to spin this in his favor. But then Evelyn spoke again. I'm sure Mr. Langston would like to paint this as a simple employment dispute, she said, pacing slowly in front of the jury. But the truth is much more sinister. She turned and gestured toward the evidence table. My team has compiled documents, emails, and witness testimonies that prove a pattern of racial discrimination within Langston Tech. Employees of color were disproportionately fired, passed over for promotions, and paid less than their white counterparts. And when I, a black woman, challenged this injustice, I was not only terminated but publicly slandered by Mr. Langston himself. She picked up a folder and opened it. Here is an email Mr. Langston sent to his board members after my termination. She read aloud. Justice Carter was a diversity hire gone wrong. She didn't belong in our company, and frankly, she doesn't belong in our industry. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Richard's stomach dropped. He had written that email months ago, never thinking it would see the light of day. Now it was being used against him in a courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and a jury hanging on to every word. He was in trouble. Big trouble. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the weight of the jury's eyes on him, their expression shifting from intrigue to disgust. His lawyer, James, inhaled sharply, flipping through his notes as if searching for a way to undo the damage. Justice Carter let the silence stretch, allowing the words she had just read to sink in. Then she closed the folder, looking directly at Richard. This email, she continued, her voice even, controlled, was sent to board members of Langston Tech. It was never meant for public eyes. But the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, doesn't it? Richard clenched his fists under the table. He needed to get a grip. His lawyer finally found his voice. Objection, Your Honor. That email is taken out of context. It was a private correspondence and does not prove discrimination. Justice Carter raised an eyebrow. Private correspondence is still evidence when it reflects intent, Mr. Holloway. She turned to Judge Reynolds. Your Honor, this email, along with numerous internal communications, demonstrates a clear bias against employees of color, particularly black employees. Mr. Langston's own words will show that he fostered a culture of exclusion and discrimination. Judge Reynolds nodded. Objection overruled. The email stays in evidence. Richard gritted his teeth. This wasn't going how he had planned. He had expected a lawsuit, sure, but not one where his opponent was a Supreme Court justice with a mountain of damning evidence. Justice Carter wasn't finished. If this were an isolated incident, perhaps Mr. Langston could claim ignorance, she continued, her gaze never wavering. But this is part of a pattern. She gestured to her team, and within seconds, a screen flickered to life at the front of the courtroom. A grainy security video played. Richard's stomach turned as he recognized the footage. It was from a company event, one he had barely remembered until now. The audio crackled before his own voice rang through the speakers. "We all know how these diversity hires work out. Give them a little power, and suddenly they think they run the place." Gasps filled the room. A woman in the jury covered her mouth. One of the reporters whispered, "This just keeps getting worse." Richard's hands turned to stone. Justice Carter clasped her hands behind her back. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this video was taken at a corporate retreat, where Mr. Langston, in a room full of executives, mocked diversity initiatives and belittled employees of color." She let the video finish before turning back to the jury. He thought no one would hold him accountable. She turned back to Richard, her eyes sharp. "But accountability has arrived." Richard's mouth felt dry. His carefully crafted empire was crumbling before his eyes, and for the first time in years, he had no idea how to stop it. Richard shifted in his seat, his mind scrambling for a way out. The courtroom felt smaller, hotter. His expensive suit suddenly felt like a straitjacket. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was a public execution. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently, "We need to change our approach, damage control, maybe issue an apology." Richard snapped his head toward him, his voice a harsh whisper. "Apologize? Are you insane? That's an admission of guilt." James exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Richard, they have you on video. They have your emails. We're losing." Richard refused to believe it. He was a billionaire. He had won bigger fights than this. He forced a smirk, straightening his posture. "We'll spin this. Say the video is edited. Say the email was a joke. The media loves a good redemption arc." Justice Carter's voice cut through his thoughts. "Now, let's discuss the defamation," she said, her tone calm but firm. "After terminating me, Mr. Langston went on a public smear campaign, labeling me incompetent and unqualified." She turned back to the evidence table, lifting another document. Exhibit C, an article published 3 months ago in which Mr. Langston states, and I quote, "Justice Carter was a mistake from the beginning. She didn't belong in a leadership role, and frankly, I question how she ever made it through law school." Another wave of gasps rippled through the room. Richard's stomach twisted into knots. He had said that. He had thought it would blow over. Justice Carter tilted her head slightly. "For those unfamiliar with my credentials, I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. I served as a federal judge before my appointment to the Supreme Court. Yet Mr. Langston, a man with no legal education, deemed me unqualified." The jury's faces hardened. Richard could see it happening in real time. He was losing them. His lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is turning into a character assassination." Judge Reynolds raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Holloway. I suggest you focus on a rebuttal instead of interrupting." Richard clenched his jaw. He was used to controlling the room, bending situations to his will. But here, now, he had no control. Justice Carter took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Langston, I have spent my career upholding justice, defending the voiceless and ensuring that men like you don't operate without consequence. You thought I was powerless because I was a black woman in your company. You thought firing me was the end of the story." She let the words hang for a moment. "But I am the Supreme Court justice you never saw coming." Richard's smirk had vanished completely. He knew then, this wasn't just a lawsuit. This was his reckoning. Richard felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. He had walked into this courtroom believing this was just another legal annoyance, a problem he could throw money at until it disappeared. Now he was watching his reputation disintegrate in real time. The jury members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from neutral to disapproving. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. A few spectators shook their heads, whispering among themselves. Justice Carter continued, her voice unwavering. "For months, Mr. Langston has portrayed me as incompetent, as someone who didn't deserve my position. And yet, when I left Langston Tech, your company's stock fell nearly 12% in a week. Investors panicked. Internal reports cited loss of key leadership as a contributing factor. She turned and gestured to another document on the screen, an internal Langston Tech memo dated just days after her termination. This memo, she said, was sent by your own chief financial officer, warning that my dismissal could result in legal action and financial instability. You ignored it. Richard's mouth twitched. He remembered that memo. He had laughed at it back then. He wasn't laughing now. Justice Carter faced the jury again. Mr. Langston's actions were not just unethical. They were reckless. He didn't just terminate me. He tried to erase me, to make an example out of me, to send a message to every other black employee in his company. Know your place. A murmur of agreement rippled through the spectators. Richard's lawyer stood up, clearly desperate to regain control. Your Honor, let's not turn this into a spectacle. The facts remain. Mr. Langston had the legal right to terminate any employee he deemed unfit for the company's vision. Justice Carter's lips curled slightly. Unfit? Interesting choice of words. She took a few measured steps toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about who was really unfit. The defendant wants you to believe I was fired because of incompetence. But the reality? She picked up another document, holding it up for the jury to see. This is my performance review, issued just weeks before my termination. The rating exceeds expectations, in every category. Richard felt his stomach churn. Justice Carter turned to face him directly. So tell us, Mr. Langston, what changed in those few weeks? Why did an employee with outstanding performance suddenly become unfit? Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Justice Carter nodded. That's what I thought. She let the moment settle before turning back to the judge. Your Honor, we've established motive, pattern, and intent. We've shown that this wasn't an innocent termination, but a targeted attack meant to humiliate and erase me. And now, it's time for Mr. Langston to finally face the consequences of his actions. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be truly powerless. Richard swallowed hard, his once unshakable confidence now reduced to a fragile shell. The weight of the evidence against him was unbearable. And the worst part, it was all his own doing. The jury members were no longer just listening, they were judging. He could see it in their eyes, the disgust, the disappointment, the certainty. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, his gaze sharp as he addressed the courtroom. Given the overwhelming evidence presented, we will now move to the defense. Mr. Holloway, your client may take the stand if he wishes to testify. Richard's lawyer turned to him, whispering urgently. Don't do it. We can still spin this, settle before it gets worse. But Richard's pride flared up. Settle? That would mean admitting defeat. No, he could talk his way out of this. He always had. Slowly, he rose from his seat. I'll testify. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Justice Carter merely folded her hands, watching him with that same unwavering gaze. Richard adjusted his tie and walked to the witness stand, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The bailiff swore him in, and then he sat, gripping the arms of the chair as if it were his last anchor. His lawyer began. Mr. Langston, can you clarify why you terminated Justice Carter? Richard forced a chuckle, trying to regain his old charm. Look, I run a massive company. Tough decisions have to be made. Sometimes people aren't the right fit, regardless of their past performance. Justice Carter leaned forward slightly. Even when they exceed expectations? Richard hesitated. Corporate leadership is more than just numbers. It's about vision. Justice Carter didn't blink. Tell me, Mr. Langston, was it your vision to belittle me behind closed doors? Or was that just an added bonus? The courtroom fell silent. Richard's throat went dry. She wasn't letting him breathe. He started, but she cut him off. You called me a diversity hire gone wrong. You said I didn't belong in the industry. She tilted her head. So, was it my job performance that led to my termination? Or the fact that I, a black woman, dared to take up space? Richard felt heat rising to his face. That's not... Justice Carter turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence. She gestured toward her team. A second video flickered onto the screen. This one was from a private Langston Tech retreat, and it was worse than the first. The screen showed Richard, drink in hand, laughing among executives. His voice, dripping with arrogance, filled the courtroom. Black employees always play the victim. Give them a raise, they want a promotion. Give them a promotion, they want to run the company. Can't ever just be grateful. The courtroom erupted. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was the end of him. The courtroom was in chaos. Gasps, murmurs, and the furious clicking of cameras filled the air. The video continued playing, but Richard could no longer hear it. His pulse was pounding too loudly in his ears. Judge Reynolds slammed his gavel. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. The murmurs died down, but the damage had already been done. The jury had seen everything. The reporters had seen everything. Justice Carter stood, her face unreadable. No further questions, Your Honor. Richard swallowed hard as his lawyer wiped a hand down his face, looking utterly defeated. There was no saving this. Judge Reynolds turned to the jury. We will now proceed with final statements before deliberation. Justice Carter stepped forward. Your Honor, members of the jury, today you have witnessed undeniable proof of Mr. Langston's discrimination, his abuse of power, and his attempt to silence those who speak out against injustice. He didn't just fire me. He sought to destroy my credibility, my career, and my dignity. She turned, locking eyes with Richard. But he failed. Richard's stomach clenched. Justice Carter faced the jury again. Today is not just about me. It's about every person who has been overlooked, dismissed, and degraded because of their race. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that power does not exempt a man from consequences. She nodded once. I rest my case. The courtroom fell into a thick silence. Judge Reynolds turned to Richard's lawyer. Mr. Holloway, does the defense wish to give a final statement? Holloway hesitated before standing. He was beaten, and he knew it. We have no further statements, Your Honor. A stunned murmur swept through the room. Even Richard's breath hitched. No defense. Judge Reynolds nodded. Very well. The jury will now deliberate. The jury exited the room, and for the first time since the trial began, Richard had nothing to say. He sat there staring blankly ahead as the weight of everything crashed down on him. 30 minutes later, the jury returned. Judge Reynolds turned to the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The man, a middle-aged gentleman with glasses, stood. We have, Your Honor. Richard felt a bead of sweat slide down his temple. The foreman cleared his throat. On the charges of unlawful termination, racial discrimination, and defamation, we find the defendant. He paused. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted once again. Richard felt his stomach drop. The judge's voice was firm. Mr. Langston, you will face the full legal consequences of your actions, including significant financial penalties and possible further litigation. Justice Carter remained calm, watching Richard without gloating, without a smirk, just quiet certainty. Richard had laughed at her once. Now the entire world was laughing at him. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his mind blank. Guilty, on all counts. The words echoed in his skull, louder than the chaos unfolding around him. Reporters rushed out of the courtroom, eager to break the news. Camera flashes flickered like lightning. Spectators murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads, others smirking in satisfaction. His lawyer turned to him, whispering urgently, "Richard, we need to talk about appeals, settlements, damage control." But Richard barely heard him. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel, restoring order. His voice was sharp. "Mr. Langston, this court finds you liable for racial discrimination, unlawful termination, and defamation. A formal sentencing hearing will be scheduled, but be assured your actions will not go unpunished." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Justice Carter stood, gathering her papers with an air of finality. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself. As she turned to leave, Richard found his voice. "Wait." She paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. The entire courtroom went silent again. For the first time, Richard saw her differently. Not as an opponent, not as a diversity hire, but as a force he had never understood. A force he had underestimated. He swallowed hard. He hesitated, the words bitter on his tongue. "I didn't think it would come to this." Justice Carter studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "No, Mr. Langston, you didn't think at all." With that, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The moment she exited, the courtroom doors burst open. A flood of journalists rushed in, their microphones and cameras aimed directly at Richard. "Mr. Langston, how do you feel about the verdict? Will you be stepping down as CEO of Langston Tech? Do you regret your comments about Justice Carter?" Richard stood slowly, ignoring them, his body moving on autopilot. He could already see his future unraveling. His stock was going to plummet. His board would likely vote him out. His name, once a symbol of power, would now be forever associated with disgrace. As he made his way through the crowd, a young black woman, an intern for one of the media outlets, locked eyes with him. Unlike the others, she didn't ask a question. She simply smiled, not out of malice, not out of revenge, but because she knew this moment was bigger than him. Justice had won today. And for the first time in his life, Richard Langston realized money couldn't buy his way out of this one. Power can blind people, but justice never does. Richard Langston believed his wealth and influence could protect him from consequences. He mocked those beneath him, thinking he would always win. But in the end, truth, preparation, and integrity prevailed. This story is a reminder that no one is above accountability. No matter how powerful someone appears, their own actions will always catch up with them. Treat people with respect because the same people you look down on today might be the ones deciding your fate tomorrow. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.